Good morning, everyone. It's a true pleasure for me to host Victoria Piai here at the University of Barcelona. Victoria is an associate professor at the Doctor's Institute for Brain Cognition and Behavior at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. She leads a group focused mainly on language production. But what has been fascinating and especially formative to me personally was how well she joins different methods, first of all. So, for example, neurophysiology and structural neuroimaging, and it's something that we have spoken about yesterday in a smaller group. But what I think fascinated me the most is how you were able to join also work with healthy people and with neurological patients. But probably the most of it all is how you venture in joining and going beyond the language production. So also venturing towards different approaches to how we understand cognition. And for example, looking at these limits between language and memory. And that's something that we're going to talk today. But that's not all, because finally, another venture is also this idea of actually joining philosophy of science with cognition and cognitive science. So the floor is yours, Victoria.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's been a real pleasure to spend this week here. Everyone has been taking very good care of me, so I've had very exciting conversations about all kinds of things at lunch, during lunch. So thanks so much for the organizers and for the people who've met so far. I'm also very excited about the discussions we're going to have, and also a little bit apprehensive, but that's, I think, the nice thing about it. So what I thought I would do today, especially given the context in which we're in, there's a little bit of a personal story in what I'm going to tell you. And it's that the fact that I started reading philosophy already during my PhD. This was, I think, in 2010. And I think around 2010, I started getting annoyed with the fact that people would use the term mechanism in their papers, and all they would show was an fMRI blob in the brain somewhere. And here's the mechanism of, and then the cognitive term next to it. And it annoyed me profoundly because there was nothing in there that showed what to me was a mechanism. It's like just a blob. And I started wondering, like, yeah, what is actually to say that there is a mechanism for something in the brain? And then I found this book by, I think his name is Bechtel. He's a philosopher, and he has this whole framework of mental mechanisms. And I thought, here it is, the book that will tell me what these things are. And then I read the entire book, and I was even more annoyed because at the end of the book, I had even more questions and absolutely no answers. And that was, I think, my first encounter with philosophy. And then I thought, yeah, that doesn't really help. But rather than giving up entirely, I continued reading things coming from philosophy over time. And I think now I've learned, but I still have a bit this thing that I approach all of the philosophy papers that I read with this urge to find answers. And all I get out of it is more questions, and it's frustrating. But at the same time, I think it has given me a lot of structure in my thinking. So it's been very helpful in that sense, that I now better understand what my questions are and what it is that I don't know. So I thank the philosophers for that, for not giving me any answers, but it has helped me nevertheless. So what I'm going to discuss with you today, let me see if I get it right, and where I should point. So this is now turned. Oh, yes, my bad. I'll present to you work that I've been developing together with Jolien Franken. You see Jolien there. Jolien and I did our PhDs at the same time, but she comes from philosophy and worked on cognitive neuroscience and went back to work with philosophy. But she knows very well how to navigate these two because she's done both. And so Jolien has this very inspiring, to me, it's still a very beautiful paper that she wrote with Mark Slors and Carl Craver. And after reading that paper, I really thought, this has all that I need to be able to shape what are the questions that I'm asking. And I was really thinking a lot about this language and or memory thing, like how should we see language in the context of cognition? Where does it overlap with memory? So I went to Jolien and I said, Jolien, could you please help me formulate my research, how I should approach my research program to tackle that question. And we sat down and started really working on this question, and it turned out again that it's rather a question that has no answer, as always. And so we presented this whole brainstorming that we had during the European workshop on cognitive neuropsychology. That was extremely helpful, and we wrote a paper based on that. So if you're interested in that question, then I suggest you read that paper. But I'm not going to discuss this paper in particular today. What I'm going to do is, first of all, briefly, and not at all doing justice to the beauty and complexity of that first paper, but I'm going to show you a little bit what the ideas are in that paper, because they are also relevant for what I'm going to tell you then, which is work that I've done with Jolien, which is then taking some of these ideas and applying it to the question of what the language network is, or how should we be seeing language in the context of cognition, but also its neurobiological basis. So again, I'll touch upon the things in that first paper, not doing justice to it. And some of my slides are really slides that Jolien made and used herself. Okay, so first of all, what is ontology? And so a cognitive ontology, if we would try to define it, let's say, it would be a systematic classification of our cognitive capacities. And if you open textbooks on psychology, what you get is something like this, right? So in this case, we have the core processes, we have the control processes, and then there's one chapter on attention, one on action, one on memory, one on language, etc., right? So this is a ontology, right? So we would classify it in this way. Language is a different thing from memory, and memory is a different thing from attention. And one can ask the question, is this the right way to classify cognition, right? The functions. Is this the right partitioning that we should use? And maybe some of you who work on cognitive psychology in general struggle a little bit with this as well sometimes, right? Like, yeah, this task measures this, but it feels like it's also doing a little bit of the other thing. So I think when you're having those struggles, you are actually a little bit in your head working with this idea of what is the right cognitive ontology to use. And some people have, in a way, proposed that once we have imaging, functional imaging, once we can measure the brain will help us tell what the right ontology is. Okay? So we are now asking the brain to give us part, at least, to help us shape what the answer should be. So this is a quote from Price and Tristan, I think, illustrating that. The issue a little bit with that is that we know that we have a many-to-many mapping problem. This is a figure, again, that Jolien has made, and I think it helps us see this very clearly. Let's see if I have a pointer. So for a particular cognitive capacity, which can then again be further broken down into maybe subcapacities, we would have tasks that we can associate with these subcapacities, and then we have all of these brain areas. But what is clear is that it's not one subcapacity, one brain area, another subcapacity, another brain area, right? And that we kind of know that that's not how things really work. What we have is a many-to-many mapping. Lots of areas will map onto lots of subcapacities, and lots of subcapacities will map onto lots of brain areas. So this is kind of a hard thing to do. So the question then becomes, what is the role of neuroscientific evidence in revising cognitive ontology? And that paper has both of the papers that I gave you in the introduction have lots of interesting discussions about that. Well, what I'm going to discuss is this one in particular, which Jolien calls the mechanistic anchoring approach, which is the idea that we can use facts about neuromechanisms to anchor, decide, help structure facts about cognitive ontology. Okay, so it's that idea that the brain will help us tell what the right cognitive ontology should be. And what Jolien has done is actually take this and work out where the issues we get into if we try to use this mechanistic anchoring approach. following a particular definition of what a mechanism is, but that's a discussion that I'm not going to have. And that the analysis of that problem is beautifully put in this paper, and in which they present what they call the cycle of kinds. These are three interrelated problems for a proposal of revising our cognitive ontology on the basis of neural data. So on this side here, we have the operationalization problem, and you can kind of see this side of the figure as being at the level of cognition. And then on this side here, we have the boundary and the abstraction problems, which are more at the level of the brain. And what we're going to see is, so say the idea is that if you want to know on the side of cognition what the ontology would be, we use things that we know about the brain to help us decide that, right? So we look at the mechanisms for deciding what the right ontology is. And we'll get then to the illustration of the issues that you run into in this case. Okay, so the operationalization problem arises because we can't really observe our cognitive capacities independently of our choice of task, right? We always need a task to access cognition, be it a task in the lab or be it just in general, right? Like me speaking, you could say, is a cognitive task in that sense, right? So we can't observe the lemmas and the lexemes in my head. We need a task. We need speaking. We need to observe it from the head. And if we are going to say, naming pictures and making judgments about old or new in a memory task, whether they are converging tasks or not, requires us to make a decision that they measure the same thing. Because we can't really tell just from what we are observing that they measure the same thing. And when then do we decide that two tasks measure the same capacity? The mechanistic anchoring approach would say, well, that's when we look at the brain, right? The brain will help us tell these two things are the same because they elicit the same mechanism in the brain. So the idea is that we determine or not whether two tasks are the same, giving us the same cognitive capacity, given that they elicit the same neuromechanism. Okay, so we are here. From the capacity, we look at the mechanism to be able to tell the capacities. Then the question becomes, okay, when are two mechanisms of the same kind? Right? Because then that's the next question that you have to ask. And that means that we need to decide on the appropriate grain of abstraction for describing those mechanisms, right? Because again, otherwise we just can't say what is relevant or not for our answer. And then we turn into the abstraction problem, the fact that there is just no uniquely correct, in absolute terms, degree of abstraction for describing any given system, right? So you can say, should we measure the cells? Should we measure oxygen consumption in whole areas? Should we measure the neurophysiology? Should we measure connectivity? I don't know, in principle, none of these are superior to the other, right? Just in themselves. So you could then say, well, two mechanisms are mechanisms of the same kind when we see no relevant differences between them. But then again, right, what is relevance here, right? We just don't know. So in a way, we then have to revert to saying, well, two mechanisms are of the same kind when they relate to that capacity, or when they are informative, relevant for that capacity. But in a way, then we are again using the mechanism to help explain the capacity, but we are supposed to use the mechanism. We are supposed we're supposed to decide about the capacity by looking at the mechanism, but now in order to decide whether the mechanism is relevant or not, we need to look again at the capacity. And in a way, you enter a loop, and the brain that was supposed to tell us what the right partitioning is no longer helping us decide, because we can only decide whether the brain's partitioning things by looking again at the capacities we started with. So that's on the level of the abstraction problem, and there's also what I'm not going to discuss here further, But there's also the boundary problem. So what parts are we going to count as being part of the mechanism and what parts not, right? So take, I don't know, a particular type of brain response you get in a task, and that it has a chain of events, and you just don't know for one particular process in that chain, is this really part of the process itself, or is it kind of a necessary condition for the process to happen, right? So you don't know where the boundary of the mechanism falls. And then how to tell whether that is part of the mechanism or not? Well, let's look again at our tasks and our capacities. This is maybe a language thing. This is a memory thing. But then again, right, then we are returning again to the capacities to help us understand what the brain data is telling us. So you enter in a loop, or in this cycle, and the brain in the end is not doing what it had promised it would do. So, which is kind of summarized here. So which mechanisms are relevant for our taxonomy is going to depend on what we want our taxonomy to do. But the mechanistic anchoring approach had promised us it would help us solve the ontology problem. And in the end, it's not, because we are having to use the definitions of our capacities to help us understand what the mechanisms are. Okay? And so they argue in the paper beautifully that this is not a vicious cycle, right? Because you could see this in a negative way, that you say, we keep looping and we just never get anywhere. So they have a positive twist in the paper saying, look, this is not vicious, because at every step there is refinement. We adjust our conditions, our understanding is improved, and we can refine all of these steps in the end. I think you can agree or not with that. I think I've turned more and more pessimistic as we go, that this really has no real solution, which doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. And that's a little bit what I want to go into now. So in this paper, it's when we first sat down and tried to apply this very specifically to a case. I came to Aline, like I said, saying, okay, look, there's this whole thing that we don't really know sometimes whether some processes are language specific or whether language should fit within the memory box. Like, we don't know how to think about it. And we analyzed the problem as such and came up with a couple of suggestions for how we could move further with this discussion. One of the things being that maybe we won't be able to answer where exactly to slice the domains, and that's fine. Kind of that's the take-home message from that paper. So if you're interested in that, I suggest you go and check this one. And what I want to tell you now about is when we took this kind of, not necessarily a step further, but given the tools for thinking that Jolien had provided to me, I then started tackling what I see, because I work on language, and what I see is a big problem in our field with the way we are asking and answering our questions about the language network, as it's usually called in the literature. So you see here a very influential paper. I don't know, those of you who are not familiar with it, it's an extremely influential paper from an extremely influential researcher and kind of view and approach in the field. So what they are proposing is that the language network in the brain is a natural kind. And for those of you who don't know what a natural kind is, it corresponds to a grouping that reflects the structure of the natural world rather than the interests and actions of human beings, right? So what they are saying in this paper is that the language network exists as a thing, regardless of how we test it, regardless of how we try to partition it. You know, it's not an artifact of our tasks, not us imposing something onto the brain. It is a thing that exists in nature, and it will always emerge as such, regardless of how you try to tackle it. Is that a good explanation of the? Yeah. Okay. So that's their proposal, right? And that is in kind of, there's a fierce debate going on now in the field by people who completely disagree with the idea of there being a language network. Oh, and sorry, by the way, so this is an illustration of what the language network would be. So in the brain, you get a set of regions that together form the language network. They co-activate, they do things together to give you, the capacity of language. It's this set of areas and not the other areas, because the other areas, according to them, are actually doing other things, other capacities, rather than the language one. So say this area here is only giving you perception, this one is giving you motor planning, and these areas in green are giving you knowledge and reasoning. But they are not language. Language is a different thing than knowledge and reasoning are. Okay? And you see again that the areas associated with knowledge and reasoning do not overlap with the language areas. That's kind of the idea in their paper. That's the core of their theory, in fact. And I guess you can imagine that this upsets many people, right? I think not only from the perspective of what is highly criticized of this being a localizationist thing, right? That you get these areas do these things, these other areas do these other things, right? So in a way, there's a kind of a one-to-one mapping idea behind this, that this area is language and not these other things. And these things are not these areas in the brain. So one of the responses to this particular paper, for example, is framed in terms of language is widely distributed throughout the brain, right? So it's not that thing that you show there. Once you start, according to these authors, once you start measuring it in the right way for real, what you get is that the entire brain is doing language, which is the complete opposite view of this let's call this the localizationist view. So I read all of these papers and I start thinking a lot, and I'm now going to share with you what I think are the problems with the ways these questions are being asked and answered, right? So this is kind of an analysis that Jolene and I have come up with when looking at these problems. One of them is in defining language itself. The second one is with identifying the neurobiological basis of language. These two things are separate things, and I think people also conflate them, right? I've learned again from the philosophers. The cognition is one thing, the brain's another thing. We just don't put it all together in one bag and start discussing things in an unstructured way. These are two different problems. And then finally, there's the problem when we overlook the goal dependence of our questions, right? And the thing that I think to me is very nice is the fact that 1 and 2 are principled problems, but I see number 3 as an attitude problem. And that means if it's an attitude problem, that it's actually partially modifiable. And in a way, it may offer us a little bit of a solution to problems 1 and 2. So let's break down the problems. Oh yeah, and the very important thing that I think the common cause of all of these 3 is this underlying assumption that we should search for the one description of the neurobiology of language, right? That there is a one description that is the ground truth, and we should be searching for that one description of it. I think it's in all of these 3 points that we have that underlying assumption once we start asking these questions in the way that people ask in the field. So let's take the problem of defining language. So if you take that language is the cognitive capacity to use syntax, operationalized via the processing of sentences during naturalistic listening. This is not a quote from the authors, but in that paper they are saying actually the only thing that is uniquely human language is using syntax, and you can only tap into that if you don't give people a task. Okay, that's kind of their definition in a way. And you take someone else, which is a colleague next room to mine, who says that language is a multimodal, socially embedded phenomenon. Okay, so these are completely different definitions of language. And then no wonder that if you're if you ascribe to the first one, your research program is going to be entirely different than if you ascribe to the second one. And we run into this thing again, that like the only way that we can do anything with language, we need to define that in terms of what we can manipulate and measure. Again, we are bound to our tasks, to our operationalizations. So we have different choices to make at this point. And to me, I think we have, I don't know if this is because I'm too familiar with the field of language, but I do think that language has an even more serious problem than, say, other fields like memory or attention or, I don't know, what have you, action, because we have words, we have sentences, we have discourse, semantic, syntax, phonology, comprehension, production, phonemes, morphemes, and you go and add. This is already kind of a messy thing that doesn't follow a hierarchy. So we already have this issue of at what level are we going to go with our operationalization? But even if you say, no, okay, I'll focus very clearly on lexical access, I think we then still have the problem that there are multiple ways in which we can operationalize this, right? So you can do processing of sentences versus scrambled words, or picture naming for low versus higher frequency names. These are all potentially tapping into lexical access. So we have this one-to-many mapping problem, right? That from one cognitive capacity, we have many operationalizations that are possible, right? So we are back to kind of this figure here. So for long-term memory, we can have a delayed recall task. We can have I don't know exactly what this is. We have another task, right? And the funny thing that at some point, Yolene asked me if I could make such a figure for language, right? She said, like, put on the one side language, and then put on the other side the tasks, and then try to draw the arrow so that you get a feeling for yourself where the problems lie. And I don't even know how to draw that figure, right? So to me, it's already scary that I don't even know how I'm supposed to draw this thing. Because again, like we have these chunks that we tend to group under a particular level. These are the different level, these are the different level. They are not structured necessarily in a hierarchical way. And then we have all of these operationalizations, and they will go to some of these, but not to others of these. I mean, this one-to-one mapping problem is even worse in the case of language, because we start with this definition of language that is already not a good definition, right? And then once I had not really made this figure, but once I had thought about this problem, I realized, wait a second, in fact, a lot of the discussions that we are having is rather at this level. It's the many-to-one problem. We keep blaming each other that your task is not measuring language. Mine is. No, mine is. Yours isn't. Right? That every single task we use is going to be insufficient to capture that cognitive capacity of language, right? No task is going to do the whole job, but no task can do the whole job. And yet people get really, in my opinion, hooked on this thing, like, but you're not measuring language, because language is this multisocial phenomenon that needs to be studied as a multisocial phenomenon. Well, but if I'm doing picture naming, it's also language, right? I never promised that it would encompass all of language. So I think people need to be really aware that there's also this, each task is going to be insufficient, and that's fine. Yeah, I always end, at least to my students, saying, don't despair. That's okay. You just need to accept and acknowledge that that's the case, right? So if you see the situation, it's unlikely, and I would say not even perhaps, but certainly even undesirable, that we end up with a single definition of language, right? Because that will never be enough. That definition is always going to be wrong in many contexts. So we shouldn't even be attempting to do it. Okay, so then the problem with defining language actually isn't a problem, right? What about problems with identifying the neurobiological basis of language? So the way we usually go about this, right, is that we take one operationalization, so say reading sentences versus reading non-word lists, and then we find the neurocorrelates at a specific degree of abstraction, right? Take the bold segment. So that's kind of the way that this is usually done. And then we take a second operationalization and we compare the neurocorrelates, right? Are these the same or not? So this is an example from that paper that I was first alluding to. So here we have, say, in this area, we have the responses in the brain for when you present paragraphs versus unconnected sentences. And here are the responses in the brain for when you present things that have structure. So from these comparisons, you would say, oh, this area apparently cares about structure, but it doesn't care about discourse, right? So one trap in here is that once you have this, which is kind of, I think, this trap, is that you say, oh, given that this area responds to these things, but not to these things, it must mean that at the cognitive level, discourse and syntax are different things, right? So we are using the brain to help us decide what is same and not at the level of cognition. So that's when we use the brain to, again, decide something about the capacity. But that's not what I'm going to focus on now, because I think there's another interesting problem here, which is, again, the fact that there's no unique correct degree of abstraction to describe the language network, right? So take the example of, I have two tasks that I think measure lexical access, and then I look at whether they overlap in a brain area from fMRI. What happens if I move to a different degree of abstraction and there's no overlap between the two tasks? And I'll tell you, I think we simply don't know what to do with that kind of evidence. So I'll do a test with you. Is this the same or a different capacity? Same or different? Different? I think most people would say it's different, right? Okay. This is moving your hand versus moving your foot. Okay. You would have to conclude that movement in one case is a different capacity than in the other case. And I did this test once, actually, it was a philosophy course that Yolene was teaching and I was there. And I actually first asked students, is movement a function in itself or a capacity or in itself? Yes, it is one thing. And then I presented this, and then they said, yeah, but wait a second, moving your foot is still a different capacity than moving your hand. And I was like, yes. Now you're again shifting the goalposts after you saw that they separate in the brain, right? So again, the definition of our capacity is changing as a function of what we're seeing in the brain, right? So we are in these cycles. So if I move to a different degree of abstraction, take, for example, neurophysiological responses to movement, these are extremely consistent. Every time you move, regardless of the limb you move, you're going to observe beta event-related desynchronization followed by a rebound. And details, it doesn't really matter, but this type of physiological response is consistent for absolutely any effector that you have, even deeper down into the basal ganglia. It always follows the same pattern, right? From that, you would have to conclude that they are the same thing. But if you look at where they are spatially, you would have to conclude that they are a different thing. Okay? So the initial conclusion that we draw from this dissociation at one degree of abstraction is in strong conflict with the empirical observation of sameness at another degree of abstraction. Right? So we arrive at opposite conclusions, and we just don't know what to do with that. My opinion is that we don't know what to do with that. So, I'm giving you the example of the motor system, right? We know very well how the motor system behaves. It's somatotopically organized. It has this structure. But we just don't know if other cognitive functions have that or not, right? So I think it's a bit tricky to just always take spatial dissociation as evidence that things are different, because you just don't know how that system is organized. So now we turn to the problem of overlooking the dependence of our inquiry, right? And I think to me it's quite relieving, refreshing, or liberating to think about it in this way. We have different goals, right, with our research. So someone may be predicting language recovery after brain damage, or aiding the neurosurgical planning, or trying to understand it at a very fundamental level, what area is doing what or in what way for production. these are all different goals, and yet somehow we are assuming that in all of these cases, there's this one real or true phenomenon of language that we want to explain in all of these situations. And the question is whether that's a, is that a good way to go about it? So basically, what we are arguing is that there's just too much wiggle room in defining language and in identifying or describing its neurobiological basis. And therefore, anything that you do that is decontextualized, right, such as the language network is a natural kind, like it's stripped off of any of the context in which that claim can be made, that is just not very useful, in fact, right? So we conclude, so this is a paper that is now under review, and probably everyone is going to hate this so much. I don't care. The issue is that all views in the current debate that is going on in the literature, in my opinion, from the language network is localized all the way to it doesn't exist, some people claim that, all the way to it's widely distributed, these are all correct and incorrect at the same time, right? So they are kind of, anything will do, basically. So what we are arguing is that we should actually use this wiggle room that we have, right? There's flexibility in there that is inherent to the things we study. Like, we can't pretend it's not there. It will always be there. So we should use it. So we should acknowledge that the flexibility is in there and make very explicitly how our inquiries are guided by their goals. So depending on my particular goal, I'll have to go for this is the best operationalization I can have, and this is the degree of abstraction that is relevant to my question, and which will be very different from yours if you have a different question. And that's kind of the view of pluralism, right? Like, there's no one definition and one description. It's many of them. And I find to me, like, it's not a very comfortable place to be in if you're accepting pluralism. And I noticed this also, with students in the lab, we discuss these options and they're like, yeah, but then we really don't know what to do, right? So I think for everyone, it feels a bit like, I don't really want to accept that. So we could say, this pluralist view has significant drawbacks, right? So knowledge becomes fragmented. Now we have, this is bold for picture naming, and this is, I don't know, ERPs for whatever, for word recognition of high frequency words, all very scattered. That's, I think, one risk that people feel we will run into, that knowledge will become fragmented. And I think the other reason why people are reluctant is that, to me, I think it's the even stronger first response you get, is that we will no longer get these clear, comprehensive answers about the neurobiological basis of language, right? Someone will ask you, okay, so how does language work in the brain? You say, well, it depends, right? Like, that's not a comfortable answer to give. So I think people are very reluctant to let go of these. The language network is this, right? We don't want to let go of those kinds of answers. But, as I've just shown you, these overarching answers are very likely incorrect in lots of contexts anyways. So they are not as useful as we think they are. And this is something that Yolene always reminds me of. And I think it's very hard putting this to practice, I must say. But it is true that pluralism does not rule out integration, right? So it becomes, if you start being explicit about things, it becomes much clearer where the commonalities and differences come from. It's easier for integration, right? So where do we disagree in our views, and where does our data disagree? I think the only issue with this is that then we need people doing the integration work, and that's really hard work to do. It's not necessarily compensated for. No one wants to do the integration work. And we, again, I would say, from at least me trying to apply some of what I've learned via Yolene and by reading other philosophy work, nice ideas out there, but how are we actually supposed to do this? I don't think there's, in practice, there's not much thought put into it yet. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention for now, and I think we can take questions that are specific to what I presented first, right? Yeah, but thanks very much.
Yeah, so so if you would like to ask questions only for this talk before we're gonna dive into philosophy, that's the moment. If you prefer, okay. Yeah.
No, it's just because I know really nothing about the neuroscience here. When you do these studies where you get people to do a task and you're seeing what's happening in their brains, how much interperson variability is there, and how much do you have to sort of smooth over those interpersonal differences to present something like a conclusion that?
Yeah, we had a little bit of this discussion yesterday. To some degree, there's always variability. I think one side of it is that variability remains within certain biological constraints. Like, you rarely see that something presented to you visually is going to be processed by your auditory cortex. So that variability is usually not there. And I think the other issue that we tend to forget is that our measures are extremely noisy. So sometimes we do see these extreme cases, and it's hard to tell unless we would test much more consistently at multiple times and do all kinds of validity tests. It's hard to tell whether this is just noise. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's some variability. I think it remains constrained. And what they are arguing in that the natural kind paper is that you find this network in every single person in the areas you would expect, regardless of, and you don't do any averaging or trying to make a normalization to a normal brain. You find it in each individual. That's their claim, always within these boundaries. And people disagree with that. Yeah. Does that clarify it?
Yeah, thank you for dedicating your time to these issues, because it's not normal in our field. So I was thinking on the example of the movement, because I was thinking, if you think on the levels of description, so to me it's not a real problem in terms of neuroimaging or to see if this is the same process or not. Because if I think more on the levels of description, I don't know, think about Mars levels, what this body has to do or what this system has to do. You know, how do we solve it computationally, and then how do we implement it in the nervous system? You don't see the problem, because maybe I could say, okay, especially they are not the same regions, so the implementation is different. The algorithm might be the same, because maybe you think about the planning of the body. You know, there's some systems that work together to make the same type of computations, and the aim is more or less the same. So you could say that's not anything that could be said that is different. It's just simply the mapping at the brain level is different, but it's, I don't know if that could be.
Yes, but I think the issue is that we interpret any separation in the brain, regardless of the system we are looking at. We always interpret separation as different and overlap as same. I think we apply that logic for absolutely everything. And I took the case of movement because it's just so obvious.
The point is
right?
that you could also say, even if there are different regions, you could be saying the algorithm is the same, so we don't know.
But people don't go there, right? They stop at the regions are different, therefore either these are different cognitive capacities, which is when you kind of reverse inference, or they just say this is the description of language in the brain. Yeah. With these things not being.
But then I could turn the point to the extreme. For example, even if the same region is activated for language and memory, movement, whatever. No? The level of resolution of our techniques is really bad. Yeah. We're talking about 4 millimeters if we are in a good case, 2 millimeters maybe in some cases. So
we come to the
thousands of neurons.
Absolutely.
They could be segregated inside. We don't know. It's basically a time-dependent problem. So maybe if technology gets better, we will be able to know. So we're still undetermined at the level.
No, exactly. And again, right? It's kind of this. The problem of abstraction simply tells us we just don't know. So if you imagine that you can now measure single synapses, and we find differences in the single synapses. No one would buy into saying, that is proof that these two tasks measure a different thing, because it's at a too low level. But I don't think we reflect enough about where do we actually want our evidence to land for us to be convinced, right? We just don't reflect enough about these things. I think we stop at a too early stage. And so I've spent now, 6 years trying to see what are levels of or what are degrees that are relevant. And we see things in the neurophysiological responses. I don't know, like a shift in phase of, of 0.5 degrees in the oscillations. Is this relevant or not? I don't know. The shift is consistent across everyone. So there's a shift, but it's just a shift. Is that telling me that these two tasks are different? I don't know, because a priori I haven't defined or I haven't established any particular physiologically motivated reason why phase would be a relevant parameter. There's nothing in the literature that tells me. So we can't be taking every single difference we find as relevant, but we also don't know what relevance is. So I think we fully agree with each other. I just don't think we talk about these things enough. Yeah. And also the thing, like, there's no answer to it. I think that's what we just need to accept. There's no right answer. I saw other hands, so I don't know if do you want to, or should I take the questions? Yeah, okay.
No, I think that it may be connected to your question, and probably you answered it, but I'm not entirely clear. You were making this point that we are dominated by the assumption that when you have two different dissociated areas, then that corresponds to two different cognitive capacities, and that's an assumption that you don't think that is well supported. But then, is there also another assumption, and should we actually question it, that if you have just one area is responsible for one capacity, because why can one area be responsible for several different capacities that we distinguish at other levels, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask because in this paper by Evelina Fidavenka, right? They like pose their things and conclusions on this long time work they have with the set of tasks they call language localizer, and as you rightfully claim that there are like plenty of people who would say, oh, it's not sufficient, it's different, and so on. And I wonder, like, to expand a little bit in this pluralist view you propose. So, how should we approach this personalization idea? Should we limit our interpretation, or should we stop trying, like, let's say, localizing full language, and should restrict ourselves to some domains we need to like investigate?
Yeah, exactly right. Which is always that the problem. Yeah, so great, but then how should we do it? And then it's just, I still don't know, which is very upsetting. To me, the biggest problem is the broadness of the claim, right? So the language network, all we've done is sentences versus scrambled words. And then if you remember what I said, sure, that is language, but it isn't all of language. So I don't think it's time well spent having these types of debates, right? It is localized. No, it's widely distributed. No, it's localized. No, it's widely distributed. And then we keep doing our studies to show it's localized and not to show that it's widely distributed. To me, that's what we should not do. What we should do is try to integrate, and I don't know how, but I think making more explicit, making the claims less broad and less of these, comprehensive answers about how this one thing works. So it would be making more explicit, okay, the entire chain of underlying assumptions. So this is a picture naming task. It doesn't cover all of language. What I'm going to conclude is about picture name. It fits within language, but too bad it's to just picture name. And then slowly have done the integration part. Okay, once we have all of these sets of findings and someone spends time trying to see how they relate to each other, come to maybe something that is more overarching. But I'm still in doubt whether this overarching answer will come. Yeah, again, not very satisfactory, I'm sorry.
Maybe last question for this part, and we go for roundtable. Yeah.
I was hearing the talk. It was great talk. Thank you so much. But it actually made me think about some things that Karl Popper said about the empirical basis, and it was interesting for me to think isn't it a problem maybe that we are thinking that we must find the empirical basis somewhere else, and we should maybe try to make an informed decision about it, adopt some convention, which obviously can change then, but maybe we just have to decide what we mean by language and just research on that. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you said find evidence somewhere else.
yeah, like trying to find in their own research, how should I define the description, the empirical facts I'm trying to research on. For me, it's like mixing two different levels.
Right. But I think for sure the thing of kind of going back and refining as we go, right? Rather than indeed saying there's this one ground truth that we need to find, and this is the way that we should be looking for it. Yeah, I agree with you. But then again, I would like the philosophers to provide us again with tools for how to actually think about these questions, how to actually try to integrate things. So then maybe the invitation to you.
Yes, at some point. So now, thank you very much. So now it's one of the few. Round of applause. So today is like one of the few talks, and on that we actually have an actual change of scenery. So now I want to invite the philosophers for the round table. And Antonio. And the plan for today is as follows. Okay, so the philosophers show us their take on the papers that we have discussed today, and then we will open a round table. The most welcome is to actually have your questions. Most welcome. Otherwise, we will try to also speak to one another about the issues that we raised today. And I knew Victoria and Antonio by heart, but I do need a little help to present the other researchers. So we have Andrea Ribadu Yaduro, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Logos Research Group in the Analytic Philosophy at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. She works at the intersection of the philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of psychology, and philosophy of mind. Her current research focuses on the functional roles of representation formats in cognition, especially their involvement in the elicitation and regulation of affect. And then we have Manolo Martinez, who is Associate Professor or Professor Agregat at the Philosophy Department of the Universitat de Barcelona and works mainly on the philosophy of cognitive science and neuroscience and the philosophy of mind. And last but not least, we have Professor Antonio Rodriguez Fornells, who is an ICREA research professor here in UNDEP and in Belviche campus, where he leads an interdisciplinary research group we are called Cognition and Brain Plasticity Unit. And the group is devoted to the study of learning process and brain plasticity effects in healthy and brain damaged patients. The main topics of Antonio's research are language learning, executive functions, and the brain correlates of error and reward monitoring. So we will start with the short presentations and then we go for questions.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for being here. I want to make clear that I'm not specialized in language nor in neuroscience, but I'm specialized in analyzing cognitive processes, and I'm going to try to provide some contributions from this field. So I'm going to try to connect the debate of PI with the debate on the levels of explanation by David Marr. So as you all know, David Marr posits these three levels of analysis when it comes to studying a certain informational processing device. So there is the computational level. This asks what problem is a system trying to solve, namely what's the input and then what's the output of this system. Then we have what I think is a more interesting level, and I think it's a bit neglected in this debate, which is the algorithmic level. Here the question is what representations and processes allow the system to solve this problem. Questions such as what is the representational format of these representations? Does the system rely on symbolic structure, predictive inference, distributed vector representations, and all this stuff? And then we have the third level that I think is the one prioritized in this debate, which is the implementational level, namely how the system is physically realized in neural tissue, which circuits, which connectivity patterns, which brain regions. So importantly, these three explanations, these three levels, are not in competition. They just try to answer different questions. So the computational level asks why, like why is the process doing that? The algorithmic level tries to answer how, and then the implementational level tries to answer where is this happening? And what I'm going to try to argue is that I think that many debates about the language network arise because researchers are implicitly prioritizing between these levels without always noticing. I think that maybe prioritizing a bit too much the implementational level, so I'm going to argue in favor of maybe bringing back some explanations at the algorithmic level when it comes to individuating the language network. Especially because in this recent paper by Bradley Love, in which he reviews these levels of explanation, he claims, he says something that I really like, which is every scientist chooses a preferred level of analysis, and this choice shapes the research program, even determining what counts as evidence. And in this precise case, the question is, what counts as evidence when we want to individuate this capacity, when we want to individuate language? Should we look at the where it's happening? Should we look at the how it's happening? Should we look at the why it's happening? So the idea is, what's counting as evidence in this debate? Again, spoiler, my claim is that maybe we are prioritizing too much evidence from the implementational level, and some algorithmic considerations might help the debate. So the question here would be, should the language network be defined functionally at the brain level or computationally at the level of what is language doing? So are we identifying a brain structure, or are we identifying a family of computations? So if we prioritize the implementational level, and I think people like following what are kind of doing that, we ask, what is the set of brain regions consistently activating during language comprehension and production? And then we're going to try to find this set of regions selectively involved in language processing. We're going to have these language localizer tasks. So as Pia said, we give people sentences or strings of non-pronounceable non-words, and we see that when they read sentences, certain regions are activated, and when they read strings of non-pronounceable words, these regions are not activated. But then we could also forget about the brain and look at the algorithmic level. And here we might reason by inference. So for example, we might think about what representation and processes are involved in mapping acoustic signals when you're in a conversation to meaning. So in this case, we might maybe look at something much more realistic, which is natural context, and use abductive reasoning, think how might this be going on, without looking at the brain, to infer the set of mental operations and representations involved. And I'm going to give an example in the domain of pragmatics, such as metaphor comprehension. So imagine that we're all in a conversation, and Maria says, John is a rat. You have this input, which is, a certain set of phonemes, and then you compute a meaning from that. First of all, if you understand the metaphor, you're going to do something. You're going to work out the literal meaning of this, John is a rat. But it is implausible that what Maria is saying is that John is a rat. We assume that she's a cooperative speaker, so probably she's not wanting to say that. So then we're going to work out the metaphor. Maybe the thing is that John is a bit, not a good person. But then it might be the case that we know that Maria is a very charitable speaker. She's never criticizing people. So we think, Maria is a nice person. This is very surprising that she says that. So probably the interpretation is a second one. And then we reach the final metaphor, which is that maybe she's trying to say that John is persistent and determined, the kind of person who keeps going when others quit, something that rats do. So the basic idea in all this process, which is, language comprehension, many things are involved. Beliefs about the fact that Maria is a nice person, so she wouldn't be mean to John. Also, the emotion of surprise. We get surprised, like, would Maria say that? All these things, if we want to understand or to come up with an hypothesis about how this metaphor has been processed, need to be positive to explain the final result. Here again, we don't need to look at the brain to know that in this case, language comprehension is relying, for instance, on semantic knowledge. We rely on the belief that Maria is a nice person and she wouldn't take a mean metaphor. But again, a plausible abduction would lead us to conclude that. So, just to finish my intervention, I do think that these two different sets of findings, on the one hand, the neuroimaging results that try to locate a language network, are going to be highly selective in the tasks. But if we try to bring into the debate more natural context and to just reason abductively, what we are sometimes accused of doing armchair philosophers, mainly from a chair, you can already deduce a lot of things. But in this case, you kind of can. So it seems that language recruits many cognitive systems. For instance, in this case, again, beliefs about the psychological intentions of people. So in experiments, language areas appear extremely selective for language, at least in Fedorenko's, as I've seen. But in real cognition, language seems to interact with almost a lot of things, beliefs, emotions, etc. So there is this mediation between the acoustic input and then the final meaning that we reach. My final observation is that I think that the algorithmic level, namely thinking about cognition, is less theory-laden in this case. It does not assume a language network, but also it does not deny it. It does not assume nor denies that there is a limited, a very clear language network. You just start with an example, you work out the entities that plausibly mediate the example, and then you say, language processing needs to be in contact with this set of beliefs to process this kind of sentences. So apparent selectivity in studies, I think, like Fedorenko's, seem to be partly an artifact of the experimental task. So you're guided by the aim to find this very specific network, and then you have this very restricted task that isolates combinatorial processing and coherent meaning construction. But real language involves kind of like a richer interaction. So I think, again, that the cognitive root is less theory-laden and maybe a bit underestimated in the debate, so we can think about whether the language network is in connection with other capacities just by thinking about how people do things and not necessarily looking at the brain. And on the second hand, I think that, and I know it's a hard enterprise, as you've said, but that conceptual clarification should precede neural individuation. So before asking where language is in the brain, we must clarify what counts as language. So if language is primarily a narrow combinatorial capacity or syntax processing, then we might be fine with these tasks. But if we want to say that language is a broader cognitive phenomenon, the boundaries of the language network are going to depend on the boundaries of this broader phenomenon itself. So if we define language narrowly as combinatorial operations, the network does look selective. But then if we define it broadly as including communication, meaning, and pragmatics, it undeniably recruits many systems, and maybe it's not even necessary to look at the brain in such a specific way, I think. That's my contribution.
Should I go? Sure. So, right, so thanks for the talk, and thanks also for Andrea. So Victoria was presenting this kind of interlocking landscape of capacities and tasks and mechanisms, and how these things kind of co-determine each other and so on, and how that's problematic, and that's of course the way it is. I wanted to take a step back and think about this in terms of what philosophers sometimes call the best system kind of approach to these kinds of problems. This comes from David Lewis, one philosopher in particular. In the Franken paper that Victoria was talking about, they discuss at some point this idea of cognitive ontologies giving you the maximum bang for the buck, right? So you want your ontology to give you, so you kind of invest something in your ontology and you want to get out of it as much as you can. So I wanted to take this idea seriously, or kind of run with it for a while to see where we go. As I say, this is related to this project that people sometimes call the best system kind of project. So the idea would be that the bug in question is the complexity of the resulting description, right? So when you try to generate an ontology, what you try to do is to generate a set of descriptions of some underlying data, the things that you have recovered somehow or other, and that description will have a certain amount of complexity. The complexity, how you measure that, that's a different kind of question. There's kind of a fully general way of measuring complexity, which is related to the length of the description, but that's hardly ever possible and so on. There are other ways to measure complexity that have to do with some heuristics that you guys know much more about them than I do, like things like how reentrant the activity is, or how nonlinear a decoder that recovers the activity has to be, or how many neurons you're considering at any particular time, things like that. So some heuristic that gives you some amount, some idea of complexity. And the bang is the faithfulness of the resulting description. So whenever you kind of change the complexity of your description, you're thereby changing to what extent you can approximate data you already have, right? So, a perfect bang would be full faithfulness, so you just recover the data perfectly, but that's never possible, or even desirable perhaps. And then you go down from there. So thinking about this in this way, the capacity would be something like leaky abstractions, right? So you have abstractions, and you pretend that they somehow cover your data perfectly well, but you know that the abstractions leak from below, right? So there are things that happen at the level below the abstraction that kind of show up through the abstraction. And now the question is how leaky you want your abstractions to be, right? So in general, there's always going to be this kind of complexity, faithfulness kind of trade-off, right? So formally, there's the kind of formal guarantees that there's always going to be such a curve that the higher the complexity of the final description is, the lower the distortion is, so that the higher the faithfulness is, and the lower the complexity, the lower the faithfulness is. So you have this kind of guarantee. And in a sense, I suppose that interesting kind of cognitive ontological projects, what they do is kind of to make a bet as to the shape of this kind of curve. So what they try to say is something like, actually, with a relatively small complexity description, you already get a lot of, faithfulness, right? So you get this, I suppose, two extremes. The highest possible complexity is just the data itself, something like a data dump of things that you already know about the subject matter. And the lower possible complexity is something like a super blocky, super pixelated description of the thing, right? So in the early kind of years of Coxsci, those kinds of boxology, boxes and arrows, things that you just get the belief box and then desire box and these things, right? So that would be the minimum complexity, and you want your you're going to move up in complexity from that boxological description, but not too much, and still gain a lot in faithfulness. That's the idea, and that's, I suppose, the empirical question, right? Is that going to be possible? Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, and so on. So if you do like climate ontology, that's not going to be very possible. Climate is a very complex system, and any kind of pixelated boxological description of climate is bound to be very, very inadequate. In physics, particle physics seems to show that it is eminently possible. And how is cognitive science or how is neuroscience? That's somewhere in between. We hope it's closer to physics than it is to climate, but who knows? So anyway, within this general perspective, there's this kind of facultative aspect to abstraction, right? So how leaky abstractions are will depend on how comfortable we are with the leakiness, right? So and there's lots of things that will be relevant to that. So can we compute the abstraction? If the abstraction is very hard to compute, or it takes exponential time, then we won't like that abstraction. Is our data able to uncover the abstraction? And this is super important, as you guys were saying before. So some relatively popular recent abstractions, like neural manifolds, for instance, were only uncovered once we had like multi-electrode arrays and things like that. And I suppose neuropixels make them even more things appear in this kind of abstraction toolbox as new data becomes available, right? And then as Vittoria was saying, that it's good enough for practical purposes, for whatever things we want to use the abstractions for, right? And so sometimes moving up and down this kind of abstraction hierarchy is going to be, as Antonio was saying, kind of a nice easy thing. You just kind of give more detail, and you now move from one blob to two blobs and things like that. It's going to be fine. And sometimes not. Sometimes changing the level of abstraction will kind of completely reconfigure the cognitive landscape, so to say, or the cognitive abstraction that you work with. And I suppose when that happens, that's more problematic. Just to finish with this, kind of proposal for other ways of thinking about this kind of problem. I think it's important. So first of all, to see that this is not just an anything goes kind of matter. So the fact that there are, the complexity faithfulness curve looks like this or like that, that's an empirical matter. It doesn't depend on us. It depends on what the system does, how correlated its activity is, how nicely physically bounded the activity is, and so on. So all of that depends on the systems and not on us. That's point number one. But point number two, the fact that we find some nice sweet spot in the complexity kind of faithfulness continuum doesn't mean that that's somehow how the brain really does it or something like that, right? So that doesn't mean that that's the generative model for the data. It could just be a very good explanation / description of the data, but for whatever reason, that's just not exactly how the brain computes the thing. And then the question becomes whether we, should look for the actual generative model or just this kind of nice compromise between these things.
So if there are not yet questions in the room, I organized the questions from myself in a way that there are some of them very general and some of them are very specific.
Sorry, can I just very
course,
briefly?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
in a way, I feel that you are both saying that we should actually take that pluralist view, right? It aligns in a way with that, saying there's no the one language or the one degree of abstraction or the one complexity. It will depend on what you want it for, or it will depend on different circumstances. I feel in a way you're also converging on the we have to go for pluralism rather than saying there's this one thing and we need to find that one thing and there's one right way. We just need to find the right way to do that thing.
I don't know if I would say pluralism, because philosophers, we like definitions, and I wouldn't be that happy with 10 definitions of language being present in the science. Maybe we decide that language is going to be something that involves pragmatics, and then maybe we're going to say, and then I don't know, what Fedorenko is doing is studying, I don't know, something much more specific, such as, I don't know, compositionality or something like that. So I do think that the fact that maybe it needs to be a more fine-grained debate doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have, 10 definitions of language in the literature, because I do think that when it comes to reaching conclusions and all that, it's useful to have a univocous definition, more or less, so that people don't get confused. And I do think that there is another sense in which if we focus on the cognitive, maybe we don't need to be that pluralist. So if you focus on the algorithmic, I don't think you get the abstraction problem as you get it if you focus on the implementational level. So at the implementational level, you have these degrees of abstraction, and you're like, which one should I choose? Well, at the algorithmic level, philosophers, we have ways in which we kind of negotiate, like the amount of entities that we posit in a process. Like if you can explain the process at the algorithmic level in more parsimonious ways, namely using less entities, it's better than if you do it using more entities. Or if you can explain it with the same entities, but the observational nesting, namely the amount of cases explained by one explanation is bigger than the other one, then you can. So we have these ways of arbitrating at the algorithmic level that I think are not that evident at the implementational level, therefore reaching, making this a more pluralistic debate.
So one way of thinking of this kind of pluralism versus monism thing is to think, for instance, about categorizations. So if you're doing categorization task, right? You ask people, okay, can you please categorize objects in the room in 3 categories, and they will come with some ontology, right? And if you say, okay, now you have 5, and they will come with another ontology. Typically, if we're lucky, those ontologies will be supersets of each other. So they say, well, they say furniture, and then they will say chairs and tables and so on. In the bad case, they won't, right? In the bad case, when you have 5, then that somehow kind of reconfigures everything. But if you have pluralism of the first kind, I don't think that's problematic, right? So if you say, look, we now want just the gist of the phenomenon, and the gist looks like this, and now we want a bit more than the gist, and it looks a bit like more like that, It would be bad, I suppose, if language in this case, but whatever thing we're dealing with, has this other kind of more pathological, as we kind of increase the richness of our the fineness of our grain, things change completely, and now the categories we're using are entirely different, and so on. But this kind of going up and down the abstraction ladder, kind of pluralism, that doesn't feel relevant to me.
Mm. But then, do you think that language as such has a place in our cognitive ontology? Or, and sure, if you would say, you know, language, and then from language we have the fine-grained ones. But I just find hard to think that we'll come up with one, like you say, we like definitions, that we'll find the one definition of language as such, right? Because it is, we have both a, let's say, a linguistics-ish description of it, and we have the cognitive description of it. These are already different things, right? But then also, if we can't come up with one definition of language that is, and it doesn't need to be applicable for everything, but I'm wondering whether it would be more useful to have, rather than language as such a broad thing and trying to fit that within our ontology, that we would already make separations, or, you know, separate them at that point and say, okay, we are going to treat, but then that's hard again. Comprehension and production is different things. But then I guess if you do that, you have to accept that you've lost, for instance, where they come together. So that doesn't work either. Yeah. I'm just not sure that we'll ever get one definition or two of language that are useful in multiple contexts.
Can I say something? So the only sad thing with having different working definitions is that sometimes people seem to disagree when they do not. So if the people say there is the language network is a natural kind, and then some people say, you know, language is not a natural kind, but they are using different definitions of language. They are just speaking different languages themselves. So maybe with adopting the definition of the first ones, the second ones, indeed, they agree that in this respect, the language network. So the bad thing with many working definitions being at place is that contradictions appear to be there, that as you say in your paper, that they are really not. It's just they are speaking different languages.
So philosophers sometimes kind of try to move beyond, the definitions in this kind of natural kindy sort of way. And for instance, people say things like, the relevant kinds of kinds for science are what some people call homeostatic property clusters. It's just kind of a mouthful, which just means there are properties that go together often, although not always, and for a reason, right? So there's some reason that kind of makes this cluster of properties go together. And it sounds plausible to me, but I'm not an expert, that language might be something like that, right? So that you wouldn't have like a perfect watertight definition that only and all instances of language fall under the definition, but you will have this kind of more loose coalition of properties that tend to go together, and that kind of goes hand in hand with there being some, I suppose, when you have a syntax, then you usually also have some ability for discourse, and then you also have some, morphophonological engine that allows you to say the things and so on. And these things can kind of go together, but of course there are various different ways in which these abilities can come apart and so on. So I would, I suppose, suggest that it's possible to not, to kind of reduce the anxieties about watertight definitions by simply saying, well, it's kind of a cluster of things that tend to go together.
Right. But then I think as we are saying, we do need, when we write our work or when we try to communicate what we did, that we are explicit about not just throwing there the language network, but saying, for me now, language I'm defining in this way, and that's what I'm going to stick with. And you may disagree, but then we are clear on what we are disagreeing on, right? So then I think we are in agreement that it's about having things made more explicit rather than using bigger claims, broad claims that are not true. We were not. Can you hear us well at the back?
Yes, I want to mention a couple of ideas since I was reading the paper. Also, one of the ideas I was surprised is that there are some proposals in neurophilosophy from Patricia Churchland, with minor Macmillan, which is eliminative materials. It's basically comments on the idea that the labels we use, desires, we've been using this language or whatever, these are basically all concepts that are not going to be used in the future as soon as we solve the problem of which are the real physiological mechanisms. So so in a way, I think this is also very surprising to me, because at the phenomenological level, we all use these labels. I mean, people work on that. So people think about memory, people know about language. So we know these are concepts that are very useful. There's what we call folk psychology concepts, no? And they even have explanatory powers, so they can actually predict the behavior of people. So the question is, at what level we have to think about these aspects. No? So I'm accepting that there might be different levels of description, that if I'm working in a therapy setting, for example, I could use these concepts. I don't need to use for a patient saying, okay, now we are doing synaptic tagging, or you're changing your synaptic levels, and maybe the channels of the ion channels will be affected in the future. We cannot use that. So that means that there are different levels of description that they are useful in different contexts. So I think it's agreed with what you were saying, that what are the aims of the research? So depending on your aims and your goals, you're going to be using different levels of description. If at the end we will be at this point where Patricia Churchill saying that it's all going to be basic on the discovery of certain algorithms and the implementation of the algorithms, which could be the aim of many people nowadays. So in our field, basically, we see mathematicians and physicists and people from physics are always trying to understand these laws of thought, laws of behavior. So they're trying to think about how probabilistic probability, rational deductions, logic, for example, is basically constructing the laws of our cognition. So at a certain point, maybe we won't need to talk about these things because we will know exactly which are the mechanisms that support the methods. That's one point in the evolution. So the other comment is about this idea that you use the concept that you need. For example, I've been working on this language learning in two domains. One, try to understand in patients, a physical patient, for example, what is preserved, and immediately appeared the idea that we're not talking about language. When language is deteriorated, for learning or re-imitation of language, you need memory. So immediately we need to thinking on other mechanisms that sustain language to a certain point, like for example, learning concepts. No? So, and that's very important because it makes you think about one aspect is that the end, language is at the end. So whenever we use lexical information, the lexical information has been acquired at a certain point, and the acquisition of information is not the same as the representation that you will have at the end of this information. Of course, that could depend on theories, but so the acquisition process is very, very important. And the other thing that we've been thinking a lot is that there has been ways in the evolution of language that hijacked mechanisms in the brain that were there, and other processes that you really have, for example, learning processes, emotional process, motivational process, they all have been really involved in the evolution of language because language evolved for communication. So at a certain point, all this process has been very important, and the brain didn't evolve. Now we have a neocortical system that processes language. Okay? That probably is not the scenario it evolved. So we need to think that these mechanisms are interlinked, and the evolution of language hijacked all these neural mechanisms. No? So at a certain point is what you said also, that then if I make an experiment and then I see, for example, there is the dopamine networks activated one processing on learning languages, you begin to think, okay, the system is not as Fedorenko says, only neocortical. There are many mechanisms, for example, the hippocampus system, the reward systems, reasoning systems, for example, are really involved. So at the end, what is language will depend on the granularity of our mechanisms that we could describe at okay. And the third point is a bit more historical. We're talking here from the basic cognitive point of view, and from the evolution of psychology, we have two clear traditions. One is the one that worked on the identification of individual differences in cognitive capacities, and then cognitive psychology was involved in basically understanding particular processes. Okay? And now I feel a bit shocked that you are raising these issues, but without the other tradition. Because the other tradition is basically, I have a book, for example, which is from John P. Carroll, which is a taxonomy of cognitive capacities. And these are all traditions that has been developed basically to understand what are the sources of variability in cognition. And there basically you see decomposed on all the factors that could be associated to language, what the factors are associated to reasoning, for example. So I see a mismatch here, and I like that both traditions seems to converge at some point, that we need a taxonomy of cognitive capacities. At the other side is that individual difference never provided enough except textually. Still the mechanism is there. So you can say, okay, we had a very well description of intelligence, for example, different factors, fluid, crystallized, whatever, but still we need to understand what is intelligence and at the algorithmic level and the implementation level. So I don't see this, there is a mismatch between them, but I see the lack of this tradition, because you can also say, okay, let's get the methods from individual differences and do it at the brain level. So what happens when we began to try to understand the variability associated to all these different tasks, and basically try to see what regions are associated to that, etc. So yeah, these are my comments. Thank you.
I don't know.
I mean, I want to say something actually about so when you talk about the churchlands, and there are two things here, I think. One of them is what's the right cognitive ontology in the end. So it's going to be about beliefs or belief-like entities and desire-like entities and memories or memory-like entities and so on, or it's going to be like entirely different. Paul Churchland had this kind of techno hippie dreams of connecting to the machine directly and so on. So entirely different stuff. That's point number one. So what's the right kind of level of granularity or is it going to look like our current categories, folk psychological categories, are very different from them. But the second problem is whether we can kind of feel those other categories in our bones, so to say. So perhaps we're just always going to need to think of these things in terms of all psychological categories, and perhaps science will grow more and more apart from the way we describe our own mental life, but that's just a fact of life for us. That might be so. These two things I think are different. So on the one hand, you said this phenomenological kind of feeling that we always need to discuss things in terms of beliefs and so on. Does that mean something about what the right kind of ontology of the mental is? And it might or it might not. It might be that the right, the way kind of ChatGPT 11.0 discusses these things is entirely different. But we're always going to need to talk about this in this particular way. I think we should kind of separate these two.
Can I just, you want to answer? No, just a short question. At the moment, the initial discussions we had with Carl, like actually something that for me was very interesting is that I think that our vision of what actually is mental life is different from yours. So for us, shouldn't be, but very often we kind of we're stuck in the idea of mental life and general cognitive capacity as something reflected in the brain, and we basically think it's something that is processed by the central nervous system. But the way we spoke before about this is that for you, or in philosophy, the mental life is something else. So maybe you could just explain briefly how do you understand mental life from your standpoint?
I'm not surprised that it's different. Do you want to say something about this?
I mean, it's going to be very idiosyncratic. I mean, it's not that we all agree.
No, I think we all agree.
But it's true, we tend to posit these intermediate entities, like beliefs, desires, and partly because of what Manolo just said, like an explanation is satisfactory depending on the entities that you use. So imagine if I see someone now kicking the door and I ask, why did you do that? And he tells me, why? Because my amygdala did this, did that. This is not going to provide any actionable mechanism in me to, understand what he did, what I can do to calm him down. If he tells me, because I have this belief of this person doing that, I might, engage in conversation with him and action the thing. Or in a sense, it's like, but if I ask you for a recipe, and instead of telling me, it has carrots, it has this, it has that, you just tell me the recipe with the elements in the periodic table. The same, like you tell me, instead of carrots, you tell me this, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, with this kind of bonds between them, I'm not going to be able to cook the dish. So in this sense, there is this, if you want the thing to be, in a sense, part of everyone's conversation, the kind of entities that you posit, in a sense, need to be actionable for people. So even if we reach the final description of things at a very microscopic level, I don't think we might get rid of these other dimensions that are much more actionable for us. And I think that that's the philosophical. I don't know if...
So that's one, I think, that's one important part of it. And also, I suppose philosophers are more open to things like, kind of weird scenarios in which you want to say that scaffolding, so these ideas of people or cognitive offloading, things like that. So when people say, when you ask a barman for 5 different cocktails, and so that she hasn't have to remember everything, what she does is she puts the 5 different glasses on, the counter, so that she can now say, okay, one of these, one of that, Sex on the Beach, blah blah, and she just does the whole thing. So this kind of cognitive offloading. Some philosophers, I don't know if I'm one of them, but some philosophers are ready to say those things are also mental. So kind of the mind somehow overflows the central nervous system and might even reach to the body or even to the immediate environment and things like that. So I suppose that means that if you really want to say that for neuroscientists the mind is the brain and that's it, then I suppose there is some mismatch there.
That overflow is what was interesting to me.
If I can just very briefly say that it's actually interesting because in that paper, the paper that I basically presented, we concluded that eliminativism, just getting rid of language as a term or language network as a term, are not going to work, are not going to be the solution, because ultimately we as people care and understand when we say I use language and I understand, like we understand, we get a feeling for what it means, we care about language. We're never going to be able to get rid of those terms. And it's kind of nice because it aligns with us. Yeah, sure, like eliminativism sounds great, but it just doesn't really relate to what we feel as human beings.
To me, also something related to this is so actually I really love the example with the kitchen recipe because it kind of helps me also to understand how we go in like those steps in ladder for how we define language and different possibly, I don't know, portion or ingredients of language as in your talk. But something else that really captured my attention in like those initial talks was also this idea that for philosophy of science, right, you can either opt or maybe sometimes marry just this idea, but you sometimes opt for the functionality of science and sometimes you opt for the pursuit of truth in science, right? To me, coming from clinical background, I really have a grasp on the functionality of what I'm doing. So we do preparation for neurosurgery. I know that I need to test for a specific area with a specific task, not necessarily to tap the cognitive function, but more the task. So I feel that I do grasp the functionality in my research, for example, but I don't really know how much the research I'm doing, even though it is a goal to pursue the truth behind how the language network or whatever is organized. So my question would be to all of you here is how do you think that, how well are we doing with first the pursuit of functionality in language science as of 2026, and how well are we actually doing in the other part of the same program?
So sorry, I don't know how well you're doing. I'm sure fantastic.
No, very well. That's my answer.
So one thing I think that I hope this speaks to your question, but I don't know if it does, is that I don't think there's a clear-cut distinction between the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of function. I mean, hopefully, right. So the whole kind of hope of you doing science is that when you kind of try to do describe things in a way that are conducive to making things better for your patients or whatever it is, depending on the science in question, you're somehow tapping on real kind of joints in the descriptions, right? So you're tapping on kind of you're uncovering an ontology that is actually in a sense better, in a sense that I was perhaps trying to uncover, right? So hopefully there is no debate there. So when you try to improve function, you're thereby also improving kind of the means by which you make your descriptions more true.
Yeah, but in this scale of granular, sorry, it's a very difficult word. Granularity. It's the first time I have said it in my lifetime. Granularity. In this scale of granularity, I'm moving in like a very pixelated image when I do this, right. Because I usually have one function and I usually have one brain area that the surgeon needs to test, right? So then for me, it's, that really the understanding of the language network per se, and how much what I'm doing is actually adding up to this, that's a little bit the complicated part. So I really like this idea that sometimes it's enough if you focus on what you're doing. It's the functionality of science, and I think that here something that I'm doing, for example, is it's where I can when I can add to the picture. But the pursuit of truth and the general idea of how the language network is organized, or even how can we conceptualize it, I think that's another story. So I think it's good if we come back to that. Because I really want to know what you think.
Well, yeah. First of all, I think that this thing that I had in there. Right? The question is whether there is the one truth to be pursued or to be found in the case of this debate on the language as such as a capacity and its neurobiological basis. I'm not entirely sure that there is one truth that we're going to find or that we should be pursuing, but that's, I think, a different thing. I think in general that's where I see also a bit the wiggle room or say in this continuum, right? And sometimes we have to make choices that are leaning more on the side of I need to prepare this patient for surgery, I'm going to be more limited in here. And sometimes that's not the goal. I really want you to do something that is more coming closer to the truth, that you are moving further away from this very specific thing that moves more in the other direction. I would say every little piece of knowledge you have generated regardless is ultimately contributing to that. Maybe that's what you were alluding to, right? That they are not in conflict with each other. Yeah. But I do think that the question then is, at some point you need to start integrating, right? And that's, I think, also where I ended. To me, it's still we are generating all of this, and now we realize all what we generate is quite fragmented in a way. And somehow this needs to be put together. And I just don't know how we should be putting this together. Kind of, what would be the way to go? So I think maybe what we are doing is always at this more functional. That's not a term I'm very familiar with the functional level, and the pursuit of truth ultimately will come rather from actually trying to do integration work, rather than everyone just producing their thing and not trying to get it together in terms of how to see the evidence coming together. Right?
There is not much integration.
Yeah, I don't know if you agree with that ultimately integration is going to bring us closer rather than each one of the findings in isolation, or me within my lab and another lab just within their own lab, right? That we are not.
Sure. So I can imagine that if you have like restricted kind of data, and then you try to apply your best possible kind of pixelated lens on those data, you will come up with different things, and then when you collate the data together, then other things will come into focus, right? So that sounds entirely plausible to me. So I would like to hope that more often than not, kind of the new lens is somehow compatible, to some extent with the kind of parochial lenses, but as you say, perhaps that's not always the case, or often what you gain by looking at the whole picture is kind of very, very different from. So is that the case? So is it the case that I don't know if there are kind of historical examples in neuroscience, but I should think about that. So okay, so I suppose that moving from single neuron kind of explanations of cognitive function to population cognitive function is such a move, right? So when you say what the neuron does, each of them individually is kind of irrelevant, and you really need to look at the population levels. That would be a case in which the piecemeal work doesn't really add up to the. Yeah. So it's let's hope that that's not the usual situation. And
but also that depending sometimes, because we don't know exactly what the right description is, we get to. So if we say finding evidence from this would mean A, and finding evidence from this would mean B. But these are different entities, kind of biological entities. We get both answers, and then they are in disagreement with each other. I think that's what happens sometimes, and we don't know what to do with that, right? So from this measurement, you get answer that, I don't know, language and memory are the same, but from this measurement, you get the answer that language and memory are not the same. What do we do then? I think we are sometimes in that kind of situation. Am I being too?
To my point of view, it's really strange that we talk about things like lenses.
Yeah.
So if I see the title in the paper of Fedorenko, I'm saying, I don't know, after so many years of so much research, I wouldn't say that I need to talk about language. I would be talking about neural mechanisms involved in language. It could be the use of logics, the use of knowledge systems that you have stored in the brain, and probability, whatever. But we would be better talking about the neural mechanisms. But it doesn't add anything. Say, I discovered the regions that are associated to plural language, except that you're working on a minimalist problem or something that have other goals, like saying, okay, very interested in demonstrating that language is specific, but I think most of us, we don't believe that language appear by spontaneous infusions of something. I mean, basically evolved to solve one problem, and the problem is what you were saying, which is the problem that we need to solve at some problem. We need to communicate to better survive problem. So the problem is that we use it all the brain for doing that, and all the mechanisms that we have. So I don't know, if we need now to talk about language, I don't know, does it add anything? I don't think. Yeah, it adds at a certain level, so we will still need to talk about language in certain contexts because there are people, with experience that have language, so it has a property and it has prediction value. So I don't know, but for us as researchers, what it adds.
So you're an elite.
No, but I'm really thinking that language depends on certain mechanisms. And it could be described at certain levels, but I'm sure in 80 years, for example, we'll be talking about a specific neural mechanism, not neural, but cognitive neural mechanism algorithms that has been involved in the evolution. I'm completely sure about that. So I don't think nobody will be talking in language as a title in a paper.
So I have a question about that actually. So do you think that, so is your answer to that kind of, so you're saying that language is not kind of a future-proof concept and so on. Is that the same as saying, really there are no tables because atoms, blah, blah, blah. So that some people would say that, right? So some people would say, table, that's an old concept. You just need electrostatic, shenanigans between atoms and so on. That explains everything. So is that the kind of reason why you think that language?
I don't think so, because at the functional level, language exists. So it's used. So you can use it as a functional level perfectly as a concept. But at the levels of explanation that you can use to understand language, it involves certain mechanisms. So yeah, it could be the atoms, it could be whatever. But I don't think the table uses the value because it's associated to certain properties.
So you said that language has a functional value. So the concept language, I suppose, has a functional value. So then when you say it won't be used anymore,
no, I mean at the research level, when we will be trying to discover what's the basis of language or the concept of what the mechanism that support language and so on. I don't think we will be using the concept of language. We might be using a learning mechanism, a memory mechanism, knowledge systems. But
then in a way, it's also it's another ontology, right? Because then we will what is a learning mechanism and what is the other thing. So I think we will never escape the issue.
Not really. The solution, I think, is actually what you were saying, working on the because there is, I mean, if language evolves because we have logic capacity, or the capacity of logic, for example, logic will be an important mechanism there. I'm not saying logic will appear as a label, but maybe we will think about deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning, whatever, things like mechanism. It could be like how do you learn the rules of particular languages, or you ask how to use knowledge systems to create belief systems to solve metaphorical problems in the example that you created. But I'm sure we will lose all these labels. They are too global and they're not going to be useful. Maybe ontologies for research. We'll be using it every day.
It's really, it makes sense that if you change the level of detail of the explananda, then you change the level of detail of the explanandum. So in a sense, they have to be alienated. So if we talk about explaining language in terms of connections with, I don't know, belief, reasoning, etc., we are at the problem. Then if we go to the brain level, maybe we should also change the degree of concreteness of language. Maybe we should say compositionality or syntactic operations. But it's really strange that we have this very granular level of description on the one side, and then this very broad notion on the other side. Maybe the solution is that we kind of equiparate a bit the level of granularity on both sides.
But the algorithmic level doesn't have to be the same.
Yeah. No, I was talking about if we go to very concrete neural stuff like whatever it is, whatever measure, maybe to say that on the other hand, language, and then you go so concrete, I think that at the algorithmic level, it makes sense to speak about language because it's a broader level, the algorithmic level, I would say. Like you don't go that, I don't know, maybe you disagree, but I mean, algorithms can get very complicated, but in a sense, I think it makes sense that you have notions of a similar degree of complexity on both sides, what you're trying to explain and what it's giving the explanation. And then once you have this equilibrium, it's maybe the thing is more feasible.
Yeah, I wanted to ask because I think it fits there. Like, what about you are saying there? What's your opinion on all this talks about language as an emergent function and on emergentism itself as this idea that like all the evidence in the brain, we kind of cannot construct language like piece and piece, but then it will come up after we I don't know, gather all the thoughts. Like, what's your idea on this, on language as emergent function?
I have to be honest, I don't know enough about that to reply to this question because I'm not familiar with the literature on emergence. But
and I must be honest, I never understand what that argument is. It emerges out of everything coming together. Exactly. Yeah, but that we know already, right? I don't know if you can clarify because I never understand what they mean when they say language is an emergent function.
Yeah, exactly. Me neither, because it,
okay. They should work harder on making that.
It feels like this part that is that people say often because we don't exactly have the tools right now to approach.
Sometimes it seems that people want to make a strong emergence kind of claim, but they want us to have kind of what's the thing in English? You have a cake and eat it too, or something like that. So they want to have the kind of physicalism of the thing, so everything depends on lower stuff and so on. But they also want kind of the magic to appear at some level, and then I don't think those things are compatible really. There are kind of weak emergent claims, which just means something like the following. So you can describe, it means something like there are really good watertight abstractions at some level of description. So which you can write the dynamics of a system at that level without worrying about what happens underneath. Whether that happens in general or not, that's a different question. But I understand that kind of claim. I don't know if language is like that.
Thanks for the talk. I found it very interesting. I come from a nanoscience field myself, and I found some things that might relate with this because in physics in general, we can study how the universe works, but also how atoms work. And the laws that apply to quantum dynamics are not the same that applies to gravitational waves and stuff. No? So when we're trying to explain something that has such a level of complexity as the language or even brain function in general, I get a feeling that we have this same approach as physics has to explain nature. If we want to explain the behavior of the atoms, then it's not going to be useful to predict where I'm going to throw the rock. So what I find interesting though is that there is a step in between where both models have a certain level of explainability of the reality. No? So we can understand the atom, and when we gather some atoms and we create molecules and we create a chemical reaction, then the forces that might apply, like gravity, start to make sense and they coexist in this border that if we go to higher sizes, then the quantum physics won't apply. Or if the application would be negligible. No? So what I found that goes back to what we're talking about is that I truly believe that the way of making a model somehow that can explain language in a certain level might be only found with a very multimodal approach from a lot of approaches, even with approaches that right now we might not have. No? But at the same time, I also believe that this is not going to be a definition of language, because we cannot say, for example, the definition of movement. According to quantum physics, I am moving right now.
because my atoms are going to be vibrating, but according to quantum physics, to Newtonian physics, I'm not, you know? So I think that the approach would be something like, we're not going to be talking about language anymore. I think so, because we cannot explain the overall thing with a model, because the complexity of the whole process is too much to be explained with a simple definition or with a simple model. And the amount of complexity of the different levels of size from neurons to behavior, it's too much. It's this type of bridge that we're trying to reach, no? With like cognitive neuroscience tries to make this bridge in between. And my point is that maybe it should be interesting to focus on this border between models that one explain behavior of neurons and the next level. So what model can fit both approaches in something that has a certain level of explainability of the reality? I don't know if there is a question behind that. I just sharing thoughts.
I think I got the question, but I prefer if you speak first.
That was a comment, actually. You know.
I think that what you're asking, right, is that there are levels in our understanding in which we study and understand content, and then there are levels in which we understand the operations or the mechanisms that are applied to this content, right? So if the content changes, like for you, items or the universe itself, you can still understand that there are forces, laws, or operations that are the same or similar or parallel, right? So I understand that in language science, what we could understand then if we have different levels of content, like for example, I don't know, the content may change, that we can have words or sentences, but maybe the underlying processes are somewhat parallel. So maybe and I think it's our pursuit to understand the underlying mechanisms that are kind of governing either letters or words or sentences, whatever, right? And it also makes me think something about what we spoke yesterday. Like, for example, the neuropsychology we understand in the Occidental world is really memory, language, and so on. So like now going beyond language, just the cognition, right? But for example, the Soviet way of understanding cognition with Alexander Luria was something else. It was actually working on those operations, right? So I wonder if sometimes maybe the Occidental understanding of neuropsychology, cognition, neuroscience should not a little bit have this idea that we kind of opened. Now it looks like I was interpreting your question and now I'm making the comment, right? It's not a question, it's another comment. But I wonder whether what we could actually do is to like have this conversation that we are working in a specific Occidental culturally adapted paradigm of what language and cognition is. And actually kind of approach, okay, so this is the paradigm that we're working in the 20th, 21st century, but maybe there is something like an upcoming shift of paradigm in cognitive science. And I wonder whether we kind of smell that the revolution is coming, or that, and how well we are actually doing modern science and language and neuroscience in actually identifying which is the paradigm that we're working in right now. Is it clear? The question?
Very briefly on, I think what I mentioned this, right? So then we have our ontology that is based for some historical reason on the way it is, but Luria's is just a different ontology, right? So again, I don't think we'll ever escape that as a problem. And I don't know from your perspective, but we'll always have one way to structure things, and there will be other ideas about other ways to structure things, and there's no, at least I think in the case of cognition, there's no one good solution or one good answer of this is the right ontology, but this one isn't. I think it's a different one for whatever reason, and the one is not necessarily superior or inferior, or the one should be adopted.
Yeah, but still, can we think more about the cognition, not as of the content, as in the Occidental work, because like memory, language, and so on, it feels to me more like a content question. And the way Luria poses questions, it's really far more for me like the operation that you will do either on something that is material for language task or material for memory task. So my question is more like what related to what Victor said, right? That it's not really the levels on which we work, but we know that it can be applied. Any questions? We still have 5 minutes left. Any closing remarks, comments?
Yes, so do you think that we who do, let's say, anything in take our case, language neuroscience, that we could be making more use of tools that philosophers could provide us with for, I think, not only structuring our thinking, that has helped me a lot, but also in, I don't know, like changing some of the practices or crystallizing things. Do you think we don't care enough and we could listen more to what philosophy has to say?
I hear that. No, I really don't think that's right. Not in cognitive science. I mean, cognitive science, I think, so many people, of course, have to do their research and finish their PhDs, and so that's just the way life is. But I do think that you guys pay attention. To be honest, I'm not sure about physics and the philosophy of physics. Perhaps not so much. but here I think there's some discussion. So I do think that there are some philosophers that have somehow managed to kind of make their ideas relevant to you guys, and I think that's a skill in and of itself, one that I don't have. But some philosophers like Craver, for instance, has, or Frédéric de Vignemont. There are many philosophers who are able to do that, and I think that introduces this kind of sociological kind of noise, perhaps. That some ideas are overrepresented, perhaps, but that's just the way life is, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was challenging.